All right, everyone. I think we've finally got enough seats here. Thanks for your patience. Welcome to the first Wednesday seminar for the fall 2025 semester and our first Wednesday seminar in NE49. For those of you online wondering why things look a little bit different, it's because we have temporarily relocated from our dear home over in E40. I'm Taylor Fravel, Director of the MIT Security Studies Program. It's my real pleasure today to welcome John Blaxland, who is a Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies at ANU in Australia. He's also Director of ANU's North American Liaison Office, and perhaps the only member of ANU staff with an office in the Australian Embassy in Washington, D.C. He has a fascinating career. I mean, so he's, as I mentioned, he's a Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies in the Strategic and Defense Studies Center of the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs, College of Asia, and the Pacific at ANU. So there's a long kind of nested set of titles here. Yeah. But he's also a former Australian military intelligence officer, served for 28 years, and your last appointment was as defense attaché in Thailand before transitioning over to academia. He's a highly regarded historian and has co-authored or authored more works than I will be able to mention here. But we're really delighted to have him present to us a perspective from down under, which is, of course, increasingly salient given the nature of the way in which sort of world politics are changing. So welcome to MIT SSP. We're really delighted to have you with us today.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Taylor. Wonderful. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. It's a great honor and a pleasure for me to be here with you. I'm grateful that Taylor didn't feel the need for an interpreter. But if you do have struggle with what I have to say, then feel free to put your hand up and you can wait till the end and I'll see if I can help you out. But let me just start with this map, which is my favorite. It's a Royal Australian Air Force planning map, centered on Darwin, but spun 45 degrees to give you a sense of Australia hanging off Asia, right? And of the idea of the Indo-Pacific, right? Which for Australia is a bit of a no-brainer, right? It's where we live, right? But also what the former Indonesian president, Joko Widodo, described as the Maritime fulcrum, the gateway between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. So that's where I'm from, the land down under. And it is, what I'm going to try and do is use a lot of pictures. So you're going to have to hold on to your seats because we're going to race through a lot of stuff to give you a different perspective on what the world looks like, okay? Now, as Taylor said, I've been pontificating for a while, and it's got a slight case of verbal diarrhea, I think, at least with the typewriter. That's put me in the space. As I say, it's kind of my background noise. But what I did a couple of years ago was undertake a geostrategic SWOT analysis for Australia, looking at the internal strengths and weaknesses and external opportunities and threats, which I very cockily showed to my wife, and she said, "So what, John?" And I thought, oh, brutal, right? So I had to go back to the drawing board, and she was right. I had to dig deeper, right? I had to ask the so what. And of course, when I did that, I realized I needed to come up with the distillation of the essence of what I'm trying to say here. And that is that we're facing great power competition, looming environmental catastrophe, a spectrum of governance challenges from people smuggling, drug smuggling, civil war, terrorism, etc., accelerated by the fourth industrial revolution, or everything, everywhere, all at once, or the polycrisis, if you like, right? But this is all going on, and no one agency, no discipline, no institution, no jurisdiction owns it. But all of them affect it. And that's really part of the problem. So, and then that's compounded since then by what is what could be described as a further disruption is the presidency of Donald Trump, which I as an Australian, I try and understand what's happening here and reflect on my take on what is going on. And I think there are 5 key factors that are driving it. And I would welcome your feedback. If I've missed one or if I've got it wrong, please do tell me. But essentially, we've got an economic imbalance since China joined the World Trade Organization, the real sense of the Rust Belt being a consequence of China joining the World Trade Organization, the sense of global defense overreach, of the forever wars and the $2 trillion trillion spent in the sands of Iraq and Afghanistan, while China's building the Belt and Road and fast trains across the country. The reaction to the woke agenda, this idea of Christian nationalism, and a reaction to perhaps too much diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then fourthly, the fears about the border, the fears of otherness being too many and coming in waves. And then this fifth, perhaps a compounding one, this distrust of big government, this idea of the lure of conspiracies leading to this desire to try and drain the swamp, right? Because the swamp must be evil. It's got to be cleaned out. So when you combine all that together, you face this situation where it looks like to the rest of us from outside, there's a fundamental change going on here in the US, right? With what I call a transactional retreat from ideational leadership. So we're seeing talk of annexation, of disbandment and abandonment of institutions that only exist because the United States helped form them. The United Nations is headquartered in New York, not Moscow, right? It's the San Francisco Treaty, not the Tajikistan Treaty, right? These institutions don't exist without the United States. So for the rest of us who bought in on the rules-based international order, the US-dominated international order, we haven't quite got our heads around why the US would retreat from them and cede the territory to others. That's kind of bamboozling to us, right? But I would say it's a bit like the Holy Roman Empire, right? Not holy, not Roman, and not an empire. But you kind of don't want it to go away, right? Because even though there are exceptions to the rule, there are still aspects of it that you kind of value enormously. And that's really important. And then we've got the issue of tariffs, and what seems to me and seems to many outsiders to be a damaging adversarial and transactional approach to international relations. And as I say, with the Smoot-Hawley Act, when I was a kid learning history in high school, we learned that the New York Stock Exchange crashes in 1929. The Congress introduces the Smoot-Hawley Act, that imposes huge tariffs that actually compound the crash of 29 and make the Great Depression last longer. That's the conventional theory I was taught. But somehow or other, that no longer holds, at least not with the government. And there's a question. As an academic, you know, we tend to go for, you want some quantitative data to demonstrate your case. And of course, there's none, because this is unprecedented, right? This is uncharted territory. So there's a strong assertions, but they're assertions. They're not actually substantiated quantitatively or qualitatively yet. So there's a big risk. It's a bit of a gamble. And of course, now what? And as the New York Times put it, Trump aims to unbind the executive from constraints imposed by the other branches and the normal process of administrative lawmaking. That's how it looks anyway. And as my old prof in Canada, Joel Sikorski, pointed out, he said, the left railed against globalism, hoping for a socialist global nirvana. Wrong. Instead, we've got a US Jacksonian nationalism disinclined to care about international institutions. And it's not interesting. It's not isolationism, though, right? The US is still enormously engaged in the world, but it is a mercantilist unilateralism. It's America first, in a way that, you know, has always kind of been there, but there's been a velvet glove over the iron fist, if you like. The rest of us really like the velvet, right? The glove's gone, right? And there's this really tough looking iron fist that's not so pretty. And as I say, a transactional retreat from ideation leadership, which is what perhaps is the most disconcerting thing, is that it is generating a backlash in Australia and beyond. This is the Lowy poll from the Lowy Institute showing perceptions of Trump versus Xi, and it is gobsmacking, ladies and gentlemen. And this is your closest ally in the Pacific, right? And this is what's happening. And in democracies, you can't ignore the people's opinion for too long, right? You can sustain it for a while, but if you clearly fall out of line with the popular view, you are in a hole. So there's implications here which we have not yet fathomed. And then there's commercial diplomacy, which is not part of the mainstream international relations curricula that I learned about when I was a young student. And as I say, it's a gamble with little precedence to weigh its likely efficacy. Now, it may work. Here's hoping. But dang, I'm not seeing the evidence yet, right? It's up in the air. So what I am seeing, though, is perhaps what could be described as a Yalta 2.0. We're seeing a retreat from the unipolar moment, that hyperpuissance, if you like, as the French used to call Americans a quarter of a century ago. That is no longer the case. We're seeing evidently, and I say evidently because, you know, this is a educated guess, really, in terms of what American strategy looks like. We're seeing echo of the Yalta meeting of 1944 when Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill met to carve up the world. I talked about this in Poland a couple of months ago, and there was sucking of teeth. Why? Because, of course, the Yalta the first time around left them behind the Iron Curtain. Very unpleasant for them, right? So this idea of a Yalta 2.0, well, where do you draw the line? Where are the borders? This is the map from Newsweek from a couple of months ago, which was their first take of where the borders might be. You think, OMG, let's hope that's really, really wrong, right? But who knows? This is really disconcerting. And of course, as Tom Friedman's written a couple of times now, the world still is interdependent. We're not in that space we were at the tail end of the Cold War when we had really bifurcated global economies. They're much more interconnected now. So when you do play in this space as if you are still in the 1980s, the levers don't have quite the same effect as they would have back then. The world the dynamics have shifted today. And in Australia, there's a bit of catastrophizing going on. Hugh White's talked about a post-American future. Emma Shortis at the Australia Institute, who did some work at Harvard when she was doing her PhD, has written a book, After America. And I'm thinking, hang on a minute, folks, let's not cry chicken little here. The sky isn't falling. Yes, it looks stormy, but it's not falling just yet. And I'm concerned to make the point that America is not leaving the Pacific, and there's compelling reason to think that it will stay. And I'll talk a bit about that. Amitav Acharya at the American University, also actually spent some time at ANU, wrote this really interesting book, The Once and Future World Order. I've really enjoyed it. It's a cracker of a book. Historical review with the lens of a scholar from South Asia who's steeped in Western education, but who has a different lens on the dynamics at play. And he makes the point that the West has never had a monopoly on order, and its decline could be a positive development for the world. Well, Amitav, I hope you're right, but you know, I'm a little bit uncomfortable about what that might mean, if he's right. So with all of this in mind, I'm saying, in fact, what we should be doing is kind of perhaps skip some of the great IR theorizing of the post-Cold War years and go back to basics, right? And when I talk about basics, for me, it's you start with Thucydides and his history of the Peloponnesian War, in which he distills the essence of conflict as being about three things: fear, honor, and interests. And it's a very compelling thesis, in my view, about what is at root cause of what triggers war. So Graham Allison from just across town here has written, very clever argument about the Thucydides trap, which he himself has admitted is not an inevitability, right? But the idea of fear and honor and interests, as I've put out in this Melbourne Asian Review piece, is, I think, a very useful prism to apply to when we think about policy engagement in the world we are living in, right? When we think about how to respond to the circumstances we face. And of course, as well, the return of Mackinder and Spikeman. Geography's back, ladies and gentlemen. Geography really does seem to be back. And with the idea of the heartland and the rimland. And of course, the key, arguably it's key to understanding the US fight for global hegemony. Over the last 80 years, Russia's struggled to stay independent and relevant on the world stage, and of China's plans to establish a trade route between East and West. And of course, then there's go back even further. You've got this, if you're in Ukraine or if you're in Gaza or somewhere else, are you going to wake up the next morning Are you going to see it through the night? So the hierarchy of needs, when you think about the first two, physiological and safety, when it comes to the crunch, you do have to think about the basics too. And that's coming back very much into vogue. Meanwhile, I would say Hans Morgenthau's Politics Among Nations, written at the start of the Cold War, resonates today with his application of the 9 elements of national power, which is way more than just economic and military. It's a breakdown into the components, which is a useful prism, which arguably you could expand upon with perhaps a cyber dimension today, because of the changes in the world. But it is nonetheless a very useful way of just unpacking power, national power, and thinking afresh about what that means in terms of agency and how we can apply the elements of national power in the pursuit of our interests in this very competitive environment. And of course, a return to sea power. Mahan, back with a vengeance. If you look at the People's Liberation Army Navy, its Coast Guard and its Maritime Militia, they are true believers, right? Back in vogue, ladies and gentlemen. If you haven't read it, you should pull it off the shelf. And then there's the work of a couple of colleagues of mine at the ANU, Evelyn Goh, and her book, The Struggle for Order, talking about the social compact, making room for rising powers and satisfying smaller states' insecurities, but making point that the East Asian order has always been multi-tiered. So this is something that there's a shift at play here, which Leszek Brzezinski also picks up in his Geopolitics and Strategy, where weakening US resolve would confirm the view that China has displaced the US, but China is itself facing significant challenges like economic slowdown that'll dampen triumphalism and overconfidence and complicate its appeal within Southeast Asia. And you're seeing, of course, a bit of hedging going on in Southeast Asia as a result. Michael Green, who's at the US Studies Centre in Sydney, has written a compelling thesis by More Than Providence as well. And he argues that an overarching concern driving US policy towards East Asia is a fear that a rival power might use the Pacific against them, right? And that's really important. And of course, Elbridge Colby in his Strategy of Denial, now Deputy Secretary of Policy in the Department of Defense, is it, or War? It's hard to know whose line you take on that one. He makes the point that America's defense must change to address China's growing power and ambition, and that the US can do so to deter war, right? In order to prevent war from happening. Now, whether or not he holds that thesis today, I'm not really sure, but Pete Hegseth's line at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore in June would suggest that they were holding to that position, at least in June, when he says Asia is the priority and the US will fight for Taiwan, and they're talking a big game to Indo-Pacific allies. And yet, just in the last few days, we've seen emerge a different perspective, which is kind of cooking my head, to be honest, at the moment, right? A draft of the new defense strategy places domestic and regional missions above countering adversaries such as Beijing and Moscow. Okay, all right. Where does that leave us? Where does that leave the Hegseth view? Well, I think the jury is still out, right? I'm not really sure. But I'm going to give you a little bit on geography now. Of course, you guys know this, but the world actually, folks, isn't flat, right? And Mercator, he has left us with a skewed image of the world, right? Centered on Germany, and with the equator 2/3 of the way down the map, it makes Australia look inconsequential, off to the corner, right? Of no relevance. I'm here to tell you he's wrong, right? He's done wrong, right? Here is an inversed and chopped Peter's projection with Australia top in the middle, right? As it should be. One day we will conquer the world. Okay, that was a joke. That was a joke. And because, Australia, it's a middle power with small power pretensions. One of the reasons for that is because, you guys have Lewis and Clark, right? Lewis and Clark, they find rivers and verdant valleys and lakes and wonderful opportunities. They come back and it's all beer and skittles, as they say in Australia, right? It's all wonderful, right? We have Burke and Wills. Anyone heard of Burke and Wills? Do you know what happens to Burke and Wills? When you find out, will you tell me? Right? I mean, this is what happens in the middle of Australia, that you run out of water, right? And you die, right? This gives us this small power pretensions, okay? Because while there are many similarities, there are some significant differences. But inverted, so when you think about the Indo-Pacific, when you think about this place that Australia sits in, the geography, it still really matters if Spikeman and Mackinder have anything to say. Now, when you think about Australia, as I say, middle power, small power pretensions, we, like the United States, have a long history of pushing out the First Nations, right? And we've established, like you, a federation, right? A federation of 6 states and 2 territories. But unlike you, because it's a blinking desert in the middle, we can sustain 28 million people, not 330, right? And that's a huge difference. And we live pretty much on the periphery. A few in the middle, but not very many. But what you do see is that there are strong similarities, Australia and New Zealand, with the United States. In terms of climate. And of course, Canberra is here. It's in what you could be described as central Italy, right? It is, if you haven't been, it's a secret hidden gem. It is magical with vineyards, with olive groves and the perfect climate and lots of kangaroos. It's magic. But anyway, I digress. This is the Lowy Power Index on the left there. When you see, and this is, it's not Morgenthau's 9 elements of national power, but it's 8. So it's a pretty close approximation. You get a sense of the how from the US, when you look across at Asia, you see China, 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 right? And that's understandable to a point. But when you look at the world from down under, you get a much more diffuse picture, right? You get all of these other countries and they all have agency, folks. They have agency. Right? And in that space, Southeast Asia and the Pacific, 32 votes at the UN General Assembly. Get out of here. Surely of no consequence. Well, actually, sometimes you want those 32 votes, right? In the meantime, we've got the Shanghai Cooperation that's just met recently in Beijing, expanding significantly. Prabowo Subianto, the president of Indonesia, American-trained former general, goes eagerly to Beijing. What does that augur, right? What does that point to in the future? And similarly, they've joined the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa coalition, and people are going, and it's got a degree of dysfunctionality, no question, but it is gaining traction. These both SCO and BRICS are gaining in traction, right? It's happened in just a handful of years. This has grown. And then military spending. We've seen a significant expansion of Chinese military spending. And here, I know Professor Fravel has made the case that the expanded one that has been put out there is probably a bit misleading. Nonetheless, it is way more than the declared figure that they hold to, and which is then used as the point of comparison for other powers in Asia, right? And this is something perhaps over lunch, Professor Fravel, we can debate, because I'm actually thinking there's a dimension to accounting in the US system where there's some inefficiencies that perhaps could be factored in, given greater weight in terms of discounting the relative buying power, purchasing power. But I mean, it's a good read. Don't get me wrong. Your great article in National Texas Review, Texas National Review, yeah. But what we're seeing, though, is manufacturing going gangbusters in China, right? And not so much in the United States, although we'll see under President Trump's clear, compelling initiatives to bring some of it back to the US. It makes sense given the need to muscle up industrially. It does clearly make sense. But what we've seen is, just thinking about in the 25 years since China joined the World Trade Organization, it has gone absolutely ballistic in terms of trade. Gone from China as the larger trading partner in only a handful of countries in 2000 to globally dominant in 2024, right? So I would contend this is a little bit like, now there are limits to the parallels, but a little bit like the expansion of the British Empire, which happened over about 250 years with the first industrial revolution, which needed raw materials, it then needed markets, it needed security for the raw materials and markets, and then needed governance for the security for the raw materials and markets. Now, Sir Francis Drake did not have a manifesto to conquer the world, right? But neither does China, I would contend. But there is a incremental economic dynamic at play that drove the British Empire to expand and to capitalize on the opportunities that presented themselves. That was not it was completely rational and explicable, right? I would contend there is a similar dynamic at play with China. And we've seen it only for 25 years. 1/10 of the time the British Empire took to expand to global dominance. 1/10. What's the next 25 years going to look like? OMG, right? So now, Jeffrey Ding's got a very interesting book on technology and the rise of great powers. He makes the case that when you're thinking about the revolutions, the industrial revolutions gone by, the third one, very interesting, he says the Japanese nearly came out on top with the ICT revolution from the middle of the 20th century, but they kind of lost their mojo near the end of it, right? And he's saying the fourth one is still up for grabs. And he argues creating an infrastructure of education and training systems for developing new general purpose technology skills is critical to global leadership. Power transitions in global politics may depend more on engineers than heroic inventors. So he's saying the game's not over. It is a serious competition. It's a race, if you like. But then you've got people like Dan Wang, who's just come out with a very interesting thesis. He's saying China is an engineering state which can't stop itself from building, facing off against America's loyal society. Oh, sheesh. Not so many engineers after all. Maybe MIT has a more important role in the future of the US than most give it credit. But anyway, this is a very interesting, it reveals how each country points towards a better path for the other. So this is the glass half full part of his final, after this kind of a little bit disheartening account of what the world looks like in this kind of, if you look at it in a bipolar sense, that Chinese citizens would be better off if their government would learn to value individual liberties, while Americans would be better off if their government would learn to embrace engineering. Interesting thesis. I'm a humanities guy, so I can't really speak to it, but it is an interesting thesis that I think warrants consideration. Meanwhile, Ketian Zhang from George Mason University has got a very interesting thesis she's come out with just recently as well on China's gambit and the calculus of coercion. And the very interesting argument here that China's more likely to use coercion when the need to establish resolve is high and the economic cost is low. If both are high, China will only choose coercion over issues of the highest importance, such as Taiwan and Tibet. Of course, that is clearly the hot topic, right? And when we think about how we assess the implications of this, as a former military intelligence officer, as an analyst of intelligence matters, what we were trained to do is look at capability and intent. So with capability, you look at what have they got? How good are they at using it? How much spare capacity do they have? How much can they throw at the problem, right? How good is it? And then, of course, on the intent side is, well, what are they declaring publicly they're going to do with their kit? And what are they saying behind closed doors? And then what opportunities are out there for them to exploit that intent with the capability they have, right? This is the dynamics at play. And of course, we can all think about this. We can all apply our own minds to the open source information out there by the gazillions of bits and bobs about what's happening and why. So let's step back a bit and think about Australia and how we look at the world and how there are so many points of overlap between Australia and the United States. And here, this is something for my Australian friends as well. We don't often think about this. We take for granted the fact that Australia and the United States are both continent-spanning, Pacific-facing, federal, bicameral, common law, free market capitalist, cosmopolitan, English-speaking, New World constitutional democracies. Do you know any others out there? They're pretty rare, folks. There's a special connection between Australia and the United States. We're not a challenge to you because we're a small power, we're middle power, small power pretensions. We're on the other side of the world, but we have been aligned with you for 100 years, right? And just for those interested in going to Australia, gratuitous plug here, it's English speaking. We've got fantastic flora and fauna. The kangaroos are fantastic, right? They're just amazing, right? Safe and friendly. We got the only college of Asia and the Pacific in the world at the ANU. So we've got Asia expertise, world-class education. Everyone loves an American accent in Australia, so you'll be popular. Doesn't matter how ugly you are, you'll be popular. I didn't mean anybody individually. Sorry. And you'll have the time of your life. And if you're under 21, you'll even have a better time. Sorry, I'm not allowed to say that. I don't know. And it's cheap as chips, 64 cents to the dollar at the moment. So an undergraduate degree, $30,000. Just saying. Okay, moving on. Australia, its principal ally is the United States. You have a trade surplus with us. The biggest foreign direct investor in Australia is the United States. The biggest destination for Australian foreign direct investment is the United States. The connections here are profound, right? They're enduring, they're multifaceted, they're deep, they're long-standing. Australia supports America's presence. This is a book I co-authored. With Greg Raymer. That was a Minerva Research Initiative project that led to this book on the US-Thai alliance, which we did a study on the Thailand, the only mainland Southeast Asian US treaty ally, right? The only one. We surveyed 1,800 military officers, and we could see the sense was America's influence has not gone away, but it's been eclipsed, right? And what's the United States doing about it? Well, I've just heard from friends in Michigan that the Southeast Asia Institute's closed. Funding's chopped. Really? You're walking away from this? It does my head in. It does my head in. So we have, with all this aside, we've got five key points to the relationship. One is the alliance, right? The Australia-US alliance. It's an 800-word essay that doesn't say very much, right? No headquarters, no commanding general, no forces assigned, no Article 5. So what is it? It's an 800-word feel-good essay, right? Now, to be fair, we've had many ties. This book, the Australia's American Alliance, addresses that. Many ties that have built up since then, since 1951, since the alliance was signed, that speak to the breadth and depth, the Lilliputian-like connections between Australia and the United States that are quite deep and quite profound. So that was one, the alliance. Two, the bilateral free trade agreement, which has just been subject to 10% tariffs, which is like, okay, so you've got a trade surplus and the biggest foreign direct investment. So that one's not sitting well in Australia and generating part of the blowback polling wise. Three is you got the trilateral AUKUS, Australia, UK, US submarine nuclear propulsion exchange agreement with the UK and the United States. And that's subject to review. The Colby review is going on at the moment. Fingers crossed, touch wood, that's going to work out, right? That's a three. Four is the quadrilateral between Australia, Japan, India, and the United States. And we've seen a little bit of a rocky patch there between Australia and India, the US and India lately. So we'll see how this goes. Fingers crossed, as I say. And then the Five Eyes, the intelligence sharing arrangement, which I wrote about in this book. A gratuitous plug for one of my books, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. Revealing Secrets, an unofficial history of Australian signals intelligence and the advent of cyber, which is, I had a lot of fun writing that with my colleague Claire Bergen. I'll stop now. I can't help myself. Think about this. We have a relationship that goes back over 100 years. We had federation in 1901. The Great White Fleet circles the country, welcomed with got a very warm welcome in Australia. And then, of course, from the World War I onwards, we're fighting alongside it ever since. And in World War II, of course, there's the game changer of the Battle of Guadalcanal. MacArthur, who is sent from the Philippines down to Australia, he's working with General Blamey, the Australian general and Australian Prime Minister, to command Australian forces here, not with Nimitz's forces here, because Nimitz and MacArthur hate each other's guts, we know, right? So, but Guadalcanal is the main land force battle of 1942. Why Guadalcanal? Anyone like to think why that was such a main effort for the Japanese? Bingo, thank you. The connection, the line between Australia, if you can cut off Guadalcanal, if you can dominate Henderson Airfield and run fighters and bombers from there, you can interdict the line of communication, the sea lines of communication between Australia and the North and the United States, making Australia redundant or useless as a springboard for the defeat of Japan, right? Very significant. There wouldn't be anything going on there now, would there, in that part of the world? So in this space, we have the Battle of Coral Sea. Battle of Coral Sea was about trying to seize Port Moresby. They fail. That's then when Guadalcanal happens. As for Australia, we fight the Battle of Kokoda. In Australian mythology, it's Kokoda that matters because we didn't fight in the Battle of Guadalcanal, even though HMAS Sydney was sunk and HMAS Canberra, sorry, and USS Canberra is named after the ship that was sunk defending the Marines at Guadalcanal off Sabo Island. Then the big one, Midway. Who's seen the movie Midway? Isn't it a cracker, right? I love that movie. It's great. And it shows SIGINT. For the first time, you really see signals intelligence, it's prominent. But what it doesn't do is acknowledge the role of Australian SIGINT. Because what happens is Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne is because they've got different antennas down in Victoria, southern Australia. They're picking up different communications, and they pick up the AB code. They pick up what AB is, the code the Japanese use for Midway. So they then share that with Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, so the US Navy can ambush the ambush. Boom, right? Game changer, right? This collaboration between Australia and the United States, it's the kind of precursor to the 80 plus years thereafter of top secret intergenerational trusted collaboration between our two nations that most people have not a clue about because it's all hush hush, right? But I spill the beans in revealing secrets. A couple of others have done it too, but I'm going to claim some of the glory. And in this space, we see a very interesting phenomenon happen. A industrial scale intelligence architecture emerges under MacArthur that is dominated by American officers, but it is a collaborative Australia-US venture, right? Allied Intelligence Bureau, translators, geographical, signals, Central Bureau, and ELINT radar, Section 22. Phenomenal work collaborating with the navies of the two countries, the armies and the air forces, right, in fighting the war in the Pacific. That is the precursor. So the United States leaves in 1945. Actually, the Brits then come and help us pick up the pieces and help us use the kind of rump of those institutions to then set up a post-World War II intelligence architecture that has survived to this day in a whole range of bodies that are now part of what we call the national intelligence community, right? All of it very closely aligned with the United States, with a series of entities, 10 agencies in red, with orange bits, the oversight and accountability bits, the executive control in orange and the parliamentary accountability in blue. Industrial scale intelligence apparatus integrally connected with the United States, working hand in glove routinely on stuff that most people have no idea about because you don't talk about how good you are. Why? Because the secret of success in the espionage business is in keeping your successes secret. Don't tell them, right? Don't give the game away, right? So part of that is the pièce de résistance, if you like, what Des Ball, my late great colleague at ANU, described as the suitable piece of real estate. This joint defence facility smack dab in the middle of Australia with a footprint that is gobsmacking. It is amazing. I used to be an escort officer out there. That's freaking cool. Very, very cool. If you get a chance, if you get a security clearance and go out there, you're going to be, you're picking up your jaw. Very impressive. Successive Australian prime ministers, when briefed in on this, have thought, oh, that's pretty impressive. Any fears or anxieties about it beforehand have been allayed. The sense of the utility, the efficacy of this facility has been of enduring resonance. In the meantime, we've got what the fourth industrial revolution, the digital revolution, the Copernican effects of which are to turn hoodie-wearing, basement-dwelling, introverted geeks into having to run a shop front, right? Having to develop a degree of extroversion, right? In part because we've been web-enabled and web-dependent and in turn web-vulnerable. So a Tandy store from the 1970s is now sitting in our pockets, right? And what former intelligence agency heads used to say is, I used to have to plant bugs in people's homes. Now they carry them for us in their pockets. Thank you very much, right? I'm being a little bit flippant, but it's kind of true, right? So when we're talking about cyberspace, it's physical, it's virtual, it's cognitive, it's mostly cables, right? And what happens at the start of the First and Second World War? Snip, snip, snip. And what's been happening in the Baltic and around the coast of Taiwan lately? Snip, snip, snip. Sheesh, right? And when we think about this, the hardware is the cables and the computers, the software we know about, the wetware we don't give much thought to. The 6 inches between our ears, right? That's where the main cognitive domain challenge lies, I would contend, because that's where the battle is. That's where there's a lot of competition. And when we think about what that competition looks like, it's a lot of splintering. This book by Anthea Roberts and Nicholas Lamp talks about 6 faces of globalization. It's not polarized. So there's not 2, there's 6. It's split up so many different ways, right? And never the twain shall meet. And we're seeing this manifest in social media, in the echo chambers, in the vile and vitriolic comments people are throwing at each other, across our own societies, our own people, same socioeconomic background, probably even their own family. I don't know if you're finding it, but in my family, there's quite a lot of tension, right, about where you sit and how you view things. And I would say we're facing a 6-dimensional challenge, right? Not just air, land, and sea, but cyber and space, but also cognitive, right? And it gets back to what I'm saying before. But we in the West, and I used to teach at the Australian Staff College in Canberra, we focus on this guy, the dead Prussian Karl von Clausewitz, who learned his lessons from Napoleon. We forget that from 1812 to 1815, the guy keeps losing, right? He kept losing. So, and yet for some reason, we elevate this guy to some kind of mythical status because he was so good in the first few years, right? And we draw our analogy, which we're most comfortable with, is the game of chess, where you play to get rid of players to get to the king to checkmate them, right? Somebody said, no, Americans play checkers. No, I think they play chess too. I would contend what we should be thinking about more is the Chinese strategist, is he a hybrid person? It doesn't matter. Sun Tzu, right? For whom the acme of skill is to defeat your adversary without fighting. Without fighting? Get out of here, John. Well, that's what he's arguing. And I would contend the metaphor, the game metaphor that best describes this is not chess, but Go, right? Does anyone know how you win a game of Go? Okay, someone, yeah. You surround them and you bring them over to you. You win them over. You force them into your camp. You don't remove them, you force them into your camp. Sheesh. Where would that be happening? Nowhere, really, surely. Well, I would say it's probably happening in a lot of places, right? There's a book by a couple of Chinese colonels in the late 1990s called Unrestricted Warfare, and we all dismissed it at the time because we'd just been bombing in the Kosovo War, the Belgrade Chinese embassy, and we thought, well, this is just a reaction to that. No. You take out the word warfare, put in the word competition, and click, 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 click. OMG. Look at that. It's all been going on before our eyes. But competition isn't all bad. Some of it's good, right? You actually want competition. You just don't want it to turn kinetic, right? Because you think about it, when the Cold War competition, would we have put someone on the moon had it not been for the race with the Soviet Union? I don't know. Perhaps not. So some of the things, sometimes competition's good, right? If you manage it carefully, it can be good. And of course, what we do need to do is think about not a binary of war and peace, on, off, good, bad, yes, no, but how you manage the ambiguity of gray, right? How you cope with this very complicated world where you have to sometimes compromise. You sometimes have to collaborate, cooperate, contest, and perhaps confront even, and hopefully avoid actually outright conflict. This is the nuanced, devilishly difficult world of defense and diplomacy, right? International relations. It's not simple. And in the mix is what my my current colleague, Brendan Taylor, at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre wrote about in his book, The 4 Flashpoints. He talks about the 4 flashpoints being Korean Peninsula, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and Taiwan. And it's actually a compelling thesis. These are all very tinder dry, easy to spark if they're not carefully managed. And when you think about the most popularly written one about is Taiwan, I would contend it's worth thinking about the phenomenon at play here, which was that we're thinking about Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State back in 1950, goes to the National Press Club in Washington and says, American interests extend to the border of Japan. Implications, not Taiwan, not Korea. And Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-un's grandpa, says, beauty, job's on. Boom, we're going to attack. And of course, what he doesn't appreciate is that the United States is a democracy, and President Truman actually has to respond to the dynamics of a democracy where people are up in arms. They're incensed at what's happened. So American policy changes, right? That's never happened before, has it? Kuwait, 1991, same thing, right? So a million Chinese, North Korean soldiers die in this space, including Mao Zedong's son, fighting to get back to pretty well where the war started, close to the parallel, right? For what? No self-respecting Chinese leader wants to see a repeat of that. And so I would contend the most compelling thesis is that China will try and squeeze rather than seize. And in that context, I think Ambassador Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister, in his book, The Avoidable War, talks about managed strategic competition, and I think it's a compelling one. And my colleague at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, Ian Henry, has written this book, Reliability and Alliance Independence, on the US and its allies in Asia. He makes allies fearing risk of escalation more than consequences of US abandonment will welcome disloyalty. So it's an interesting thesis about don't read too much into Taiwan. It's a complicated dynamic, okay? It's a very interesting thesis to think about. Meanwhile, Kevin Rudd has also, his PhD thesis is on Xi Jinping thought, and he makes the point, in essence, that Xi is a Marxist-Leninist nationalist. What the hell is that, John? Well, he's a Marxist. He truly believes in communism. Get out of here. Who does that at this stage? Well, you read it. It's a pretty compelling looking at all of his speeches, all of his declarations since coming in 2012. He believes it. He seriously freaking believes it, right? And he's a Leninist, so he believes in party control of the state. And who's in charge of the party? Mr. Xi himself, right? And a nationalist believing in revenge for the century of humiliation, right? That's a really sobering thesis. And that's manifested with China saying it's ready for war with America and doing a lap around Australia, conducting a gunnery exercise in the flight path between Auckland and Sydney. Nothing to see here, folks. Move along. It's all okay. Surely it's all okay, right? No, nothing to worry about. Meanwhile, who thinks about Antarctica, right? China does quite a lot. They've got 5 bases there. Australia claims 40%, but our policy there is led by scientists, not strategists. So nothing to see here, folks, surely. It's all okay. It's all just scientific research, apart from the satellite monitoring stations that help them run their low Earth orbit satellites from Antarctica. What happens also, ladies and gentlemen, if by the time our grandkids are in these chairs, that's melted? I don't know what the future looks like, but let me tell you, the competition for the resources in Antarctica is not going to go away, okay? And we do not give it much thought, to our peril. And then there's America's kind of blind spot about its presence in the Pacific. As I say, there's 32 UN General Assembly votes in the Pacific here, folks, in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. When you look at a map of the Pacific, if you look at it at all you see is micro black dot inks on the map, right? Until you add the EEZ, or the EEZ, as we say in Australia, right? The exclusive economic zone, OMG, right? All of a sudden, that's a consequential piece of real estate, right? No wonder China, which signed up to the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea with a tiny EEZ, has an interest in getting access to the fishery stocks, the seabed resources, the political influence in the Pacific. Now, these red goose eggs are where China has signed a pact, a security pact. Solomon Islands, Kiribati, Tonga, and Cook Islands. Oh, sheesh. And that's happened in the last 3 years. It's going gangbusters, right? We've just had one blocked with Papua New Guinea. We were trying to do one with Papua New Guinea, and we tried to do one with Vanuatu. Both of them been blocked by China. Chinese influence in the politics, local politics. There's unrestricted competition, ladies and gentlemen. The game is on. And American presence in the Pacific goes butts up right up to the Philippines. Not just the Aleutians and Hawaii, but all through the Compact of Free Association, let alone the territories, and of course the American footprint in Korea and Japan. So tell me the US is leaving Asia. I don't buy it. You have an enduring interest that Michael Green, Colby, and others have written about for a long time. that speaks to your geographic footprint there. But how many have how many have been there? How many have visited this part of the world? This is one, okay? A few, that's great. That's wonderful. Oh, 5, okay. Well, this is an erudite audience. Of course, there's going to be some, yeah. But my point is, the United States, in terms of policy focus, this does not feature very prominently, folks. It does not feature very prominently, right? And in the meantime, we've got a reverse opium war going on, I would contend. I think the evidence is increasingly compelling that that's what it is, right? Chinese aided and abetted infiltration of precursor materials and outright drugs through the Pacific on an industrial scale, coming through Fiji and Tonga into Australia and New Zealand, generating massive problems, echoing phenomena in the United States. Meanwhile, we've got a significant geographic challenge here. This map, the heat map, developed when my late colleague Brendan Sargent was in the Department of Defence, speaks to the heat map of the sea lines of communication. You see there the Malacca Strait, which is the jugular vein of the Indo-Pacific, or the Malacca Dilemma, right? 70% of East Asian trade passes through the Malacca Strait. It goes a long way to explain why China is interested in a Kra Canal along the Kra Isthmus there, just expanded there, and also the oil and gas pipeline from Kunming in Yunnan province down to Chagpu and the Bay of Bengal, which is this bit over here in the Bay of Bengal, to mitigate the risks of the Malacca Dilemma. And I would contend that goes a long way to help explain the BRI as well. If you reduce your dependence on the Malacca Strait, why? Because if you look at World War II, from Perth, the biggest submarine base in the Indo-Pacific, in the Pacific War, 170 Allied submarines were based there, interdicting Imperial Japanese naval traffic. The Thai-Burma Railway had to be built because no ship could get up the Malacca Strait. Sheesh. Elbridge Colby doesn't talk about it in his Deterrence by Denial. I think it's a bit of a blind spot. American thinking goes to the Philippines because of your historical connections, but doesn't quite reach Indonesia. And ladies and gentlemen, that's a phenomenally consequential country, which we ignore at our peril. And in that is Indonesia is the most prominent country in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. They talk about unity and diversity. It's more of an aspirational statement than a statement of fact because of the so many differences. This is not Europe, right? It's not a grouping of countries with a centralized government or one that has roots in one common language, Latin, and one common religion, Christianity, right? This is very diverse, very diverse. But they're all hedging, as Hunter Marston writes. He did his PhD with us at ANU too. He talks about 4 elements of hedging: blunting, broadening, boosting, and binding. And I find it a compelling thesis. When you look at the 10 countries in Southeast Asia, none of them are completely wanting to be beholden to China. They all want to have some agency. They all want to kind of do a deal with the US and India and Australia and elsewhere, Japan as well. But dang, show up, all right? I had a fellow from Thailand, a senior 4-star general. I went to staff college with him many, many moons ago. He said, John, where are you guys? Right? Where are you in the US? I'm getting Chinese people coming to my door almost every day asking to do a deal. Where's the alternative, right? And it's not just about China because, as you know, Thailand and Cambodia have been at each other, hammer and tongs lately. Why? What the blazes is going on? Well, a lot of it's domestic politics, but a lot of it is stemming from historical grievances, going back to the fact that the Franco-Siam Agreement of 1909, I think it was, drew the map here and the watershed was supposed to be it, but the French drew maps that weren't quite on the watershed, so they gave them more territory than they're supposed to. The Thais are deeply resentful of that. Americans came in after World War II, the cartographers drew new maps on the watershed. The Thais used the American maps, the Cambodians used the French maps, and never the twain shall meet. Except when you go out into the Gulf of Thailand, there's a honking big delta between the American line and the French line. Right? And guess what? Oil and gas, ladies and gentlemen, oil and gas, right? Who would have thunk that they'd actually be doing it for money? This is the world we live in, right? This is a book by my colleague, Greg Raymond, who co-authored US-Thai Alliance with me on Thai military power and the dynamics at play there for a country like Thailand that's playing off countries, very much hedging and trying to get the best position to maintain its independence. This is the enduring dynamics at work that others in Southeast Asia have looked to that Thai model to look to replicate for themselves as well. Compelling thesis. I won't dwell on that one, but I want to touch briefly on Australia's 10 points of tension, the dialectics, if you like, of Australia's position, because this, I think, it speaks to the similarities and differences between Australia and the United States, but also I think echoes phenomena across Southeast Asia and beyond that are worth reflecting on, right? Firstly, we try and reconcile our history with our geography. So we're Anglo-European transplants sitting on the edge of Asia, right? As I say, we're barely monolingual. Okay, I joked about not needing an interpreter, but most of us don't speak other than English, and so this is a bit of a challenge for us. We have a fear of abandonment, which is Alan Gingell wrote about in his magisterial book, and then of course we have this fear of entrapment. And lots of people have written about how the United States can't be trusted, and it's going to draw us into a war in Taiwan, which I think is an oversimplification, a binary of a non-binary problem, in my view. Nonetheless, so we in Australia, we kind of want the Goldilocks solution. We want the alliance, but we don't want to get sucked into a war in Taiwan. And then the debate is, well, does the alliance drag us into a war, or does the alliance actually help prevent a war from happening? Which is the position I hold, right? I think it's very critical to actually helping send a message of deterrence. And there's lots of people out there who disagree with me. This is what happens in a open democracy when you get different contesting ideas in the academia. And then the question is Australia a dependent ally or an independent ally? And Coral Bell, after whom the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs is named, makes this point that Australia is very dependent on the United States for its foreign and defense policy. I mean, we buy a lot of American kit, we plug and play with the US because we see ourselves as working with you, right? We've got a century history of doing that. But at the same time, as Shannon Tao wrote, she did a PhD with us at the Bell School as well. In her book, Independent Ally, she makes the point that Australia still makes up in its own mind, right? Nobody sits in the cabinet room from the US Embassy telling them what to say or what decision to make. What you see, though, is a strong correlation of factors, right? A correlation of interests and values that sees Australia making similar decisions for similar reasons for more than 80 years, right? And that's the context that I think is worth reflecting on. Now, we've got the defence of Australia versus forward defence. So World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, we go forward. In between, we hide behind the moat, right? And we have this, we like to, our national anthem talks about being girt by sea, but a lot of us think actually we're girt by beach. We barely think beyond the beach. And this book by Beck Stratting and Joanne Wallace, who used to be at the ANU, makes this point that the need for cultural competence and the importance of collaboration with local stakeholders, getting beyond being barely monolingual, and engaging with the neighbourhood. And here we try and collaborate a lot with the United States and have done for a number of years, also very closely with New Zealand. And of course, we're seeing that's presenting significant challenges at the moment because of retrenchment of USAID and more. We lead when we need to, and I was the brigade intelligence officer for the Australian intervention in East Timor in 1999. We went back a few weeks ago with a couple of, he was the S3, he was the S14 of the brigade. So my buddies from Interfet days, we went back and revisited glory days, if you like. So we lead when we need to, and we follow when we have to, like in Korea, Afghanistan, and Iraq. These, by the way, are free downloads from ANU Press. Another gratuitous plug for a couple of my books. Sorry about that. And in Vietnam, interesting Vietnam, most people don't realize Australia was there too. We have conscription as well. We have the social blowback you guys have as well, the same kind of protest movement. And while Martin Luther King's on the Lincoln Memorial steps declaring he has a dream, Australia's getting rid of the White Australia policy, becoming a much more cosmopolitan country, reflecting similar trends between our two nations. And we've got the debate about guns versus battle. Do we spend more on defence, or do we spend more on schools, hospitals, infrastructure, and social welfare, right? Ongoing debate. And then, of course, there's the issue of the war in Ukraine and what the effects of one end of the Eurasian landmass can have at the other end of the Eurasian landmass. And we can unpack this in the Q&A if you like. Similar with the war in Gaza. and the fact that we're seeing a coalition emerge with China helping Iran, Iran helping the Houthis, helping the Hamas, helping Hezbollah, but of course that unraveling, and then of course the blowback on Israel and the toxic dynamics at play there that is undermining the view and in kind of support for the US and its allies because of the terrible circumstances in Gaza. So what you may well ask, well, I've asked that myself. I'm saying the prospect of defence being dependent on the whim of Donald Trump points to the need for us to muscle up. We in Australia need to muscle up, and we're doing that. We've got a foreign policy that says, okay, if the US isn't going away, we need to muscle up, and we need to engage with everyone else who'll talk to us. On the security front, with the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Pacific Islands Forum, Indian Ocean Rim Association, the Quad, AUKUS, five-power defence arrangement with Malaysia and Singapore and New Zealand and UK, NATO where we can, the France, Australia, New Zealand, and as I say, free trade agreements with anyone who'll sign one with us. That's what we're doing. But for us, when we face an existential crisis, it's here, from Guadalcanal to Singapore. And in that space, there are many Australian cemeteries who fought to stop the Japanese from attacking Australia, and pretty well failed because we didn't do it right. But nonetheless, when we think about what an existential crisis might look like in the future, we think it could potentially be in that space. I won't dwell on that. But we do stress trade and connections, and of course AUKUS, and I'm happy to unpack AUKUS if you like in the Q&A, and I think it is quite compelling. A lot of contentious views on AUKUS in Australia, but that we're still spending a lot of money on it. We've just been spending $1 billion. Colby's reviewing it, and I'm saying Trump may strike a deal with AUKUS review, but he won't sink it. And Australia's right to refuse to commit into a war in Taiwan. Why? Because we don't commit in advance to hypotheticals. And by the way, we've been there for every conflict you've asked us to, right? So don't ask us a question that in an open democracy is impossible to answer without getting crucified for giving away your freedom of action. There's all questions about air independent propulsion, about sea transparency, drones and the cost. And I think they are all incomplete arguments, and I've got a counter one to them. Meanwhile, we've got chances of increased environmental challenges, the likes of which are unparalleled, right? With floods, fires, pandemics, let alone the cyber challenges and terrorism, etc., generating what people are describing as the Anthropocene, right? Very controversial at the moment in the United States, not so controversial in Australia, although there is some controversy around the fringes. And of course, the scan of potential catastrophic risks out there, nothing to worry about. It's all okay, right? Now, from an Australian point of view, we've got a defence force structured, a boutique defence force structured for the unipolar moment, when all we had to do was plug and play with you guys and help you with what you asked us to. We're now facing a set of circumstances where we're not sure you're going to be there, and where these things could happen not just consecutively, but concurrently. And OMG, that's a problem. Meanwhile, former Chief of Defence Force at the ANU as well, Chris Barry, has put out this paper just recently, Climate First Foreign Policy for Australia, saying human security in the age of climate disruption must be placed first. We need to recognise global heating as the biggest threat to humanity. It's accelerating, and we need to do whatever we can to reduce regional tension. In the Pacific, it's a felt need. If you're on an island that's only 4 meters above sea level, even a sea storm surge is going to feel existential, right? And in these places where we've got societies that, okay, once upon a time probably would have survived, but now they've grown, and they've grown dependent on electricity and on the web. And guess what, folks? Computers and salt water don't mix, right? It's really bad juju. And this is existential for them. And we need to be mindful of it. So in Australia, there's a lot of debate. What do we do? Well, you know, Albert Palazzo's talked about the big fix, playing down the need for a Navy and for AUKUS submarines. He's saying, just get lots of missiles and defend the border. Oh, okay. It's got its defense and it's got its detractions, right? Then there's Sam Roggevin, who talks about the echidna strategy. He said, well, we just need to be spiky, make it hard for people to get to us, and just mind our own business. and I'm thinking, okay, just walk away from the Pacific and walk away from Southeast Asia. What the demonstration effect of Australia has long been very closely studied by our Southeast Asian and Pacific neighbours. I think that would have a very deleterious demonstration effect. I don't think that's the right strategy. Then Bob Breen and Leah Langford have talked about the need to muscle up, about this idea of countering grey zone escalation by inviting trade instead of argument. So speak softly, but carry a bigger stick, is what they're basically arguing. And I'm saying, okay, what we need is actually not just an echidna, not just an owl, but the full menagerie, if you like, Morgenthau's 9 elements plus, right? Given a fauna kind of context. And I've tried to address that in this paper, Adapting to Complexity, which I invite you to have a look at if you're interested. So now, interesting, MIT, just finally on research ecosystems, MIT has obviously featured very prominently in the UARC and space, and Australia is now thinking about what to do. MIT, I hadn't realized this, but MITRE is derived from Massachusetts Institute of Technology Research Enterprise, which, go figure. So MIT has a long connection with advanced sensitive research going back to the Second World War, which has got some pointers for Australia, because we're needing to muscle up in this space too. And so, as I say, comparing Australia's ecosystem to yours, ours is a lot smaller. We're 1/15 the population. Clearly, we can't do it on the scale you can, but there are some pointers to what you do that are useful for us. And there are points of collaboration, I would contend, that we should be looking to explore and capitalize upon as well. Back to the bottom line up front, the bluff, as I teach my students in my class, Honeypots and Overcoats, Australian intelligence in the world. We actually need to be thinking about the full enchilada, if you like, if I can use that Mexican term. Great power competition, looming environmental catastrophe, a spectrum of governance challenges, accelerated by the fourth industrial revolution, but it looks different from down under. The light casts a different shadow. And that's why I'm saying, come and spend a little bit of time down under, because you're going to have the time of your life. All right. Thank you very much, Taylor.
Thank you so much. So this is our first seminar of the year, also our first seminar with many more people in the program. So sort of the norm is I'll sort of take a group of questions at the start of sort of the Q&A period. So if you'd like to get on the list, please raise your hand. And Caitlin, I see your hand first. Now this room is actually leaving me a little bit challenged. So you have to raise your hand above your head. So Caitlin to you, and then I'll keep the rest of the list.
Great, thanks for a very lively talk. I wanted to go back to this idea that you raised about the US moving towards what you call transactional unilateralism, which I thought was a good description. And I guess my question is, how much of that can Australia take before it starts to seriously undergo thinking about how to really reorient its grand strategy and its defense policy, and are those conversations happening? And what options is Australia exploring? It seems to me that Australia could really take over more responsibility for its own security provision. You talked a little bit about that. It could try to play hardball more with the US and think about points of leverage for pushing back on the US. And I'm curious what you think those points of leverage might be. Or it could really kind of pull away from the US and maybe even lean toward China, or be much more clearly neutral. So just, I'm wondering where this goes and what the conversation is going to be in Australia when this continues for several more years and maybe even beyond that.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for the very compelling and fun presentation. At one point, you mentioned that the US should or could move closer towards a pivot to competition with the PRC. In my personal view, the past 3 or 4 administrations, inclusive of the Trump administration, #1, has tried to pivot to Asia in that defense and economic ways. So are you suggesting that it hasn't been a fulsome enough, let's say, pivot of the national security strategy towards competition with the PRC, or that it just, in its manifestation, wasn't as effective as it could have been, for example, in the Biden administration, because there was really, in Washington, it felt that it was a very dramatic shift towards the competition with the PRC.
So let me pause here and you can respond to both of those questions.
Yeah, terrific questions. Sorry, what was your name again?
Daphne.
Daphne. Yeah, thank you, Daphne. So I'll go to Caitlin first. I'm glad you like that term, transactional unilateralism. How much can Australia take before reorienting? Well, this is the big debate. Hugh White's out there. He's a colleague of mine at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. He actually hired me, so I've got to be nice. Can't be too critical, although I'm inclined to be quite critical. He's made an argument that's resonating with a lot of people. In my view, it's an argument that kind of skips makes a couple of logic leaps that I think are not reasonable. Australia is so invested in the relationship with the United States. Australia, let's just say, even if the United States were to give in on Taiwan and let China take Taiwan, if they weren't to compete for Taiwan, it would still be in Australia's interests to maintain a connection with the United States, because if Taiwan was to fall to the PRC, that would not be the end of China's ambitions. There are some people out there who say it would be, right? I'm thinking, okay, name me a country in history, a rising power in history, that has been satisfied once it's kicked a goal, right? It flies in the face of human nature to think that is likely. So I think there's a compelling reason to think that Australia has an enduring interest in maintaining connections with the United States, not because we want to stop trading with China. We appreciate trading with China, but we think it's not a binary. It's not an on-off, yes, no, peace, war option. It's actually that triangle where you have to manage it all. You have to deal with the tension between these opposite parts of a dialectic. You've got serious competition to play. So playing hardball, there are points of leverage. I mean, Australia is looking to make the point. We have trillions of dollars in funds in our, I'm trying to remember the name of the fund of it, but we have the superannuation scheme in Australia has generated a sovereign wealth fund that is enormous. It's bigger than most of the Gulf state ones, right? That are oil based. Ours presents significant investment opportunities that our ambassador in Washington, Kevin Rudd, is looking to make connections in the United States, so Americans can see actually Australia has an enduring utility, not just because we like you, but because there are overlapping interests, right? There's real economic utility to placing an emphasis on ties with Australia. And so that is a point of leverage. And whether we're going to lean more to China, no one knows the future, but I would have thought that the pushback to the sanctions of recent years points to a trajectory that I think is sustainable. China does not trade with Australia because it likes our liberal democracy, okay? It only does so because it still thinks it's a good deal, right? And as soon as it thinks it's no longer a good deal, it's going to drop us like a hot potato. And it's going to have nothing to do with our political preferences. It's going to have to do with their hard-nosed calculation of their economic interests. So, this idea of thinking about our relationship with China as zero-sum or binary is, in my view, misplaced and unhelpful. And the idea of being neutral, it's like, look, lots of people around the fridges talk about it, but there is no strategic culture of Australia being neutral. Since Federation, we have been aligned with the greatest English-speaking power, right? It was Britain until World War II, and then it was the United States. And that's been the case for 80 years, right? And this idea that the United States is going to somehow wither away and shy away from its possessions in the Pacific, I tried to make that clear. The US is not leaving. It's got enormous geographic reasons to continue to contest, despite the review that the Politico picked up on. And so we'll see how that works out. But there are long-standing dynamics here. On whether the US should pivot to a conversation. Daphne, you make a good point. I know the United States has tried. I guess the point is we're in a situation now where it remains very difficult, and I perhaps was being overly simplistic in my observation about what's going on. I know conversations are still happening, but I think there is also a sense that there is, and let's get to Tom Friedman's point, there's an interconnectedness there that I think is perhaps underappreciated. Maybe it's not, maybe it is recognized, but certainly the vulnerabilities over critical minerals, it speaks to the fact that the United States can't just be cavalier in its approach to China, neither can Australia. None of us can. But we all have some agency, and there is clearly work, and Australia has an important role to play. Same with lots of islands in the Pacific. Cook Islands is exploring to do a deal at the moment as well, where they've got rare earths and the potential for critical minerals being supplied to the United States from non-Chinese sources is actually a game changer. And that's where I think there's significant options for playing leverage in a way that is useful for the engagement with China. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So in the interest of time, I'm going to group a few more questions.
Yeah.
Now I want to turn to some of the students. So Damien and then Jemima. So Damien, please ask your question, then we'll turn to you, Jemima, then back to
Yeah,
thank you. So I really appreciate you mentioned the intention versus the capability in the threat assessment. So I wanted to know more about how do you assess China's strategic intention? Because this is a question that I'm always thinking of. There is a huge agreement among scholars. Some argue that China is a status quo power, focusing on its own territorial integrity and territory. Some will argue that China is a regional revisionist state, and some even argue that China is a global revisionist, like aiming at changing the global order. And there are also another kind of opinion that saying that we don't care about China's intention anymore, we just focus on its capability. So I want to know what's your take on this question, and what kind of evidence we can use for support this assessment.
Jemima?
So I was really struck by that Laui Institute and all that you showed about relative reliability of the Trump versus Xi. And I was wondering whether you could speak a bit about what the public reaction was in Australia to the Chinese Navy task group operating inside Australia's earlier this year in light of that public strategy.
Yep, thank you. So great question, Damien and Jemima. Thank you both. So yeah, this is an ongoing debate in the US, Australia, around the world really. What do we make of Chinese intentions? I guess I was trying to get there with the point comparing Britain and China and the rise of the British Empire. It really, I think, depends on what happens economically from here. If China continues to grow in the way it's grown in the last 25 years, it's going to have compelling motivation to grow its ambitions. It's already signed 4 security pacts in the Pacific in 3 years, right? The Solomon Islands was the first one in 2022. And as I say, there's understandable economic reason. You want the fish stocks, you want the seabed resources, you want the votes at the UN General Assembly. This is not unreasonable for China to want this. The question is it reasonable for us to push back, right? Because that's what the debate, I think, should be. And so are they a global revisionist? Look, a lot of the rhetoric at the moment is not. But when you look at the behavior, the pattern of behavior and the trends, you would say, well, what's it going to look like in 25 years' time? If you think about what they've been doing in Antarctica, what they've been doing in the South China Sea, what they've been doing in the South Pacific, the trend line is up, right? More assertive, more challenging, more grey zone, the kind of experience that the Philippines has had in the South China Sea. And there's very little evidence in this authoritarian one-party state, driven by one man at the moment, to any indication of that being challenged anytime soon. So great question. Focusing on capability, on intent. Capability, that's it, right? Why are they going gangbusters building so much? No, I know you could argue it's about taking Taiwan. It's yes, but if they do then take Taiwan, that gives them the capability to do a lot more than take Taiwan. If you break the first island chain, then you could have the potential to unravel the rest of it. And that's Japan, and that's the Philippines and beyond. And of course, that's got enormous implications for Australia. And that's one of the reasons why Australia is dead set on staying as close to the United States as we can, even though we're a little bit uncomfortable with how transactional you've become lately, right? We still aren't walking away, right? And that's why our Prime Minister is going to be meeting with your president in the next few days. So thank you. Jemima, on the reaction to the People's Liberation Army Navy Task Force, very interesting question. The government has been trying to play it down. In part, I would contend, because they've had approach of speaking softly and not carrying a very big stick, right? Unlike the previous government, that is the one that caused offence in Beijing, spoke more loudly with a very small stick, generated reaction. There is a sense that we actually need to mind our P's and Q's, because there's not little to be gained by huffing and puffing if you can't blow the house down, you know, if I can use that metaphor. That's been the political reaction, although in the think tank world, a lot of commentators are saying we should be making more of this. The government's been playing it down because it doesn't see anything to be gained. And also it's trying to manage its financial fiduciary obligations. You know, it's got a budget to balance. It's got AUKUS draining the coffers. It's got pressures for all sorts of other financial obligations that it's struggling to meet. So playing down this is really part of that plan. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So we have time for one more pair of questions. So Eric Higginbotham and then Hanoi. I should note that Eric Higginbotham is my co-author and collaborator on the China's defense spending project, so you may direct all your constructive feedback.
Which I'll stay away from. So thank you very much for a stimulating talk and for giving us more homework than we usually get from these things. That's quite a reading list you've given us. In your slides on muscling up on the diplomatic front, a lot of your bullets are multilateral organizations or structures. I don't know whether that was conscious or just shorthand for the countries that might be involved, say, for example, in the Quad. But if I were to give you $1 worth of political capital to break into quarters or dimes or quarters or what have you, and sort of place them against priorities, how would you rate the potential benefit that Australia could get from deepening its security ties with different bilateral partners, and what types of benefits might you get from that? And if I could ask you to maybe comment specifically on Japan there and how many pennies it might get, I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
Sure. Thanks for a very magisterial talk, covering huge numbers of topics with a lot of time in history. My question actually takes us back 10 years to look ahead 10 years. If you were giving this talk 10 years ago, many of the elements would actually be similar. You'd be talking about the rise of China, the relative decline of the United States. You'd be talking certainly about strains and tensions that result from that in almost a Gilpin sense. At the same time, what's different here takes us back to another body of literature. If you look at regimes, bilateral agreements and international regimes, you look at the treaties, you look at the alliance structures, and you look at WTO. There's a big difference, and the name Donald Trump kept coming up, with Trump's reversals on many obligations being notable in terms of your talk. The question is that looking ahead 10 years, when you're giving the same topic with a different treatment here at MIT, to what extent are the things that you emphasized today likely to matter or not? To what extent are the assaults and attacks on the regimes, to kind of go back to Cohen and Nye, reversible or irreversible? Understanding that the Gilpin factors do continue.
Thanks.
Wow, you guys, tough questions. Thank you. Really great. So it's very interesting. I touched briefly on the 2017 foreign policy white paper that I call Australia's foreign policy plan B. It's you look when the United States, the relationship becomes less certain, you reach out to kind of strengthen other ones. There's no question the Quad is part of it. So India and Japan, we're deepening connections. We've just signed an order to purchase some warships from Japan. That is symptomatic of a deepening policy priority from Canberra on making action with Japan. It's very convenient because Japan is a trusted, close US ally. So there's a high level of interoperability in that space already. I used to be, as a J2 of our Joint Operations Command, I used to oversee the thing called the Joint Command Data Exchange, JCDX. So the Navy people will probably be familiar with it. It's this incredible situational awareness tool that's a US copyright system, but it's shared with the spokes, if you like. Australia and Japan operate it, but in stovepipes, right? So there's an enormous amount of commonality and options for just with a flick of a switch connecting between our two countries at the operable tactics and operations level, a high level of interoperability already. And we're seeing that manifest in a deepening security compact between Australia and Japan that looks set to go even deeper in the future. But for us, beyond that, we've just tried to sign a pact with Papua New Guinea, which used to be a League of Nations mandated colony after World War I. It was a German colony, but we got it after the war. And they got independence in 1975. But they're very close relationship with Australia for the last 50 years. And we've just tried to deepen that. That got partly sabotaged, it appears, from Chinese influence in politics. It may yet still happen, I'm not sure. So Papua New Guinea matters, and it goes to that map I put up of where we faced an existential crisis in what was essentially in World War II called the Netherlands East Indies. It's now Indonesia. Okay, that space, Indonesia, Timor, Papua New Guinea, and across the Solomon Islands and Singapore and Malaysia, that space is where we are investing, particularly with Indonesia. It's a country 10 times our population and the largest Muslim democracy in the world. It is a really consequential, it's the gateway between the Indo-Pacific. It's got the jugular vein of the Indo-Pacific. It's got a bebas done active, they call it free and active foreign policy. It's where the Bandung Declaration was signed, the non-aligned movement sprung from there. So they are playing both sides, but for Australia, we're really trying to we're socializing with them the idea of, okay, if there's a solids fan interface, if you like, as they say, in the polite way of describing a crisis. That was a joke, by the way, but anyway. If there's a crisis, that Indonesia will gravitate towards Australia. Now, that they won't be afraid of us and that they will be comfortable with us cooperating. Why? Because when we last did so, we did so in Ambon, in Kupang, in Dili, in Java, in Singapore, in Rabaul, right? These places most people have never heard of, but they are where hard-fought battles were fought and lots of Australians died to stop those places being used to bomb Australia. They subsequently were used to bomb Australia, right? Darwin got bombed more than Hawaii, more than Pearl Harbor. So this territory, that space, what happens there matters, okay? And we are actively engaged in that space to make sure that Indonesia is well disposed to Australia and that we're never going to have an alliance with them because they've got this free and active, non-aligned sense of identity. But we want them to feel completely comfortable with Australia as a trusted partner. And we want the US to be in that space too. So we are looking to facilitate that as best we can as well. And we've just done a combined exercise in Indonesia with the US Army, US Marines, and Australia Defence Force across the three services. We don't have a Marines, a separate force. And they have been working with the Indonesian Armed Forces. So there's a lot more happening now with Indonesia than was ever imaginable 20 years ago. So quite a lot more happening. So that's where I place that. Ken, yeah, great question. You're right, a lot of continuity, some discontinuity, and the biggest discontinuity is the shift to transactional retreat from ideational leadership. As I put it, looking to 2035, I think there is a sense, and my reading of it, what I read from Europe and certainly in Australia, is that we are seeing that may be the new normal, and that who knows, but it's perhaps going to be the new normal, and we have to adjust our expectations and not see this so much in terms about, you know, we used to talk about shared values, and of course there was lots of DEI related agenda items that we'd work with the US happily hand in glove in the Pacific and elsewhere. You don't talk about it that much anymore, right? Okay. But what we do see is nonetheless an enduring sense of interests overlapping, and in terms of hard power and the other elements of power, where we see it's in our interests to remain engaged with the United States collaboratively as possible, mindful of the fact that we have so many points of commonality, right? We both kind of speak the same language. We've got, as I gave you that long list of the points of overlap, Australia and the United States. Can you think of two countries more closely on so many fronts, right? Thank you.
Great. So we started a little bit late, but we're also out of time at this point. So my apologies to those of you I wasn't able to get to on the Q&A, but please join me and thank you, Professor Blaxland. And we'll reconvene next week. It'll be a slightly different seminar. Austin Long is going to talk about his perspective working on nuclear policy.